All right, welcome everybody to our second episode of Paleo Talks. This will be an ongoing series. We are sponsored by the Center of Excellence in Paleontology at East Tennessee State University. And I'm Dr. Blaine Schubert. I'm the director of the center at the Gray Fossil Site. And before we introduce our speaker today, I do want to introduce our co-host, David Moscato. Go ahead, David.
Hey, thanks, Blaine. Yeah, I am one of the paleontologists at ETSU in the Gray Fossil Site, and I am the Gray Fossil Site Science Communicator. And I will be co-hosting and then also managing, so I'm, as we speak, admitting people into the meeting. And then later on, I'll be monitoring questions. So we're going to start out with, Blaine's going to be talking Josh through some of his presentation about the Gray Fossil Site community, and then about halfway through the talk, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So when that happens, we'll let you know to go ahead and start typing your questions in the chat, and I'll be reading them out for Josh to answer.
All right, perfect. Thank you, David. And so our guest speaker today, and this is going to be sort of a back and forth, is Dr. Joshua Samuels, who is a vertebrate paleontologist like myself, like Chris Widga, who was on last week. And he is here at East Tennessee State University in the Department of Geosciences, but he's also a curator at our Natural History Museum at the Gray Fossil Site. And today he is going to talk about one of his research areas, and that is the community structure at the Gray Fossil Site. And so Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you, and if you will introduce yourself a little bit more and tell us about your research interests.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm Josh Samuels, like Blaine said, and I've been at ETSU for going on 4 years now. My research in the past has largely focused on what's called ecomorphology. So I look at the anatomy of living animals and then compare that to fossil animals to figure out what they were doing, basically the sorts of lifestyle they had. And in particular, trying to look at things like diet and locomotion. So the way things move in the environment, what they eat. And a lot of what I've been doing since I've been at ETSU is studying the things at the Gray Fossil Site, trying to identify the species there, and then also trying to understand what sort of ecology we had at the Gray Fossil Site. So what the different organisms were doing and how that compares to living organisms in the area, but also other places in the fossil record at the same time.
Great. So Josh, you know, just to sort of get people up to speed, the Gray Fossil Site was discovered back in 2000. You arrived here in 2016. Shortly after Dr. Wallace and I were finishing up our big NSF excavation grant for the site, where we were able to get a lot of things out of the ground, but really hadn't gotten to start studying a lot of it yet. So since some of our listeners aren't necessarily that familiar with the site, could you give some background about the site as you start to show some of your slides? And my questions that I have for you first is, you know, what did you think about the site and the collection when you first got here and started looking at it? And then what would it be like if you could go back in time 5 million years ago and sort of explore this area? So
Okay.
let's switch over to your slides.
All right, hopefully everyone can see those. And so really what I'd like to highlight is how unique the Gray Fossil Site is. And really what the site represents is it was an ancient sinkhole deposit. So you had lots of karst features in the area, just like lots of places in North America. You've got these underground caves from dissolution of limestone, and sometimes caves collapse and create sinkholes. And the idea here is that we had a sinkhole form and it filled with water, and that was something that attracted animals to the area. So this kind of mural image from the McClung Museum is showing the kind of community and the things that were living around that sinkhole environment. And what's really interesting about the site is that it's the only site of its age in the Appalachians. So I had a paper with Dr. Wallace and Keela Bredehoft a few years ago where we described a new wolverine from the site, but also used biochronology to determine the age of the site. And based upon the different animals living there, it's between 4.9 and 4.5 million years old. And really, when we look at the fossil record of this region, going before the Pleistocene, it's pretty much devoid of fossils. Really, there's lots of Pleistocene Ice Age sorts of sites around, but we don't have things before that. So this is giving us an earlier window. And when I got here, that was really exciting to me. A lot of my research before was studying sites from this same time period. So I really got my start working at Hagerman fossil beds in Idaho, and that's between 3 and 4 million years old, so slightly younger than Gray. And then before coming here, I worked at John Day fossil beds in Oregon, and the youngest sites there were around 7 million. And so I kind of looked at things that were a little older and a little younger than this. And what I can do here is put the knowledge I gained from those sites to understanding what we have here. And it's really a radically different sort of environment. And the thing that was really exciting about all of the work that had been done prior to my coming here is that there was a lot of material to already work with. It wasn't that I had to go out and look for fossils. Lots of excavations have been done, and there were lots of large and small animals, lots of vertebrates like I tend to study, and also some invertebrates, but then lots of plant fossils. And so we could really get a complete picture of what the environment was like. And that's a real rarity when we look at fossil sites. It's not a common thing that you can see that sort of plant and animals alongside one another and use that to understand a site.
So if you could take people back 5 million years ago to the Gray fossil site, what would they see? Would they be staying in an open prairie? Would they be in a forest? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so really everything we've got at the site, the plants and the animals both suggest it was a heavily forested environment. And there's quite a lot that we've got to support that. So there's a lot of pollen and plant macrofossils, things like leaves, seeds, wood, that all point to it being this sort of oak, hickory, pine forest environment. And then some of the animals at the site, particularly things I'll talk about later on, are animals that really prefer forest environments. So we have tree squirrels and flying squirrels at the site. Tree squirrels live all over the place, but flying squirrels really only live in forests that are dense enough for them to jump from tree to tree. And the fact that we've got a decent number of specimens of those from the site says it really was probably a fairly closed canopy forest. And picturing it, it really wouldn't have been, at first glance, something that was a lot different from what you'd see in the Smokies today. So walking around this area and the kind of more pristine woodlands you'd find, that's probably a lot of what it was like. But we do have a lot of interesting things that were added into that. So we have a lot of animals that are probably the ancestors of what we have here now in the eastern forests. But then we also had things like alligators, rhinos.
So Josh, can you go ahead and move us through some of your slides so we can
Sure.
see some of this?
So in total, the fauna and flora at the site, there's 95 vertebrates. The vast majority of that's mammals. Part of that's just because a lot of the people who are studying the site know mammals, and that's part of why we have had as much knowledge there. There's probably quite a bit more to learn about things like fish and some of the amphibians and birds at the site. We've also got lots of plants at the site. So more than 100 species of plants have been recognized based on wood, leaves, pollen, seeds. There's also been invertebrates found at the site. Most of these are the kinds of things that would be living in a pond or a lake environment. So things like clams, different kinds of beetles and snails, but they haven't been studied a lot. And some of the really common things at the site are things like these tapirs. So Tapirus pulchensis is one of the really characteristic things at the site. Tapirs are incredibly common. Really, there are more fossil tapirs at the Gray fossil site than you will find modern tapirs in any collection in the world. Similarly, we've got this rhino that was described as a new species last year by Rachel Short and her colleagues. And Teleoceras is a big rhino, hornless rhino that was living all over North America at the time. Some of the other really characteristic things at the site, the things that you wouldn't expect to see in Appalachia today are things like this red panda, Pristinolurus. And this was something that was discovered at the site fairly early on. Originally, it was something that was described just from teeth. But since then, we've actually had multiple skeletons turn up. We've got very complete skull and jaw, as you can see here. This is really part of an entire skeleton. There's several more of those. We also have things like alligator. And when the site was first discovered, it was initially thought to be an Ice Age site. There were things like ivory from a big elephant found, and people initially thought it was Ice Age, but then things like rhinos and alligators didn't live in this region at the time. And so those immediately pointed to it being an earlier sort of site. Some of the new sorts of things that have been showing up at the site, we had, like I said, a couple of years ago, we described a new wolverine from the site, and it's very interesting. We only have a few teeth and a little fragment of the skull, but that's how a lot of the other things were initially discovered. And there's enough here to say, yes, this is a wolverine. It's different from living wolverines, and it's living outside of wolverines' known range. So it's living further south. An interesting thing about wolverines is today they really only live in relatively cold places. We think of them in boreal northern forests all over the northern hemisphere, really doing things like walking around on snow, feeding on things like caribou, moose, elk. But we have it living at the Great Fossil Site along with alligators. And it's important to remember that going back nearly 5 million years, this is before the ice ages in the northern hemisphere. So it's a time before we really started to get the cold conditions that we think of wolverines adapted to now. We've also had a skunk turn up recently. This is one called Buis nictus. Spotted skunks and striped skunks live here today. Finding a skunk in the fossil record shouldn't be particularly surprising. We also have a single tooth so far of Basiriscus, and that's a ringtail. It's a member of the raccoon family. They tend to live further south, parts of the Southwest down into Mexico, but they're a more climbing adapted, more fruit and insect eating sort of member of the raccoon family than raccoons today. We've also had some interesting new ungulates show up. So I pointed to the rhino and the tapirs that are incredibly common at the site. We've also had, these are a few specimens of a thing called Pediomyrex, and they're a member of a family called the Dromomoricidae. They're commonly called the giraffe deer because they have these ossicones on their head. They didn't drop them like the antlers of deer today, but they're fairly closely related to the deer family, and probably lived a pretty similar lifestyle. And then we've got a big camel that we've been working on. I've got a student working with me right now studying this. It's possibly Camelops. Odd thing to think of, a camel, a large camel wandering into a relatively dense forest, but possibly it could be drawn to something like the water at the environment. We also have a lot of rabbits at the site, and up here I'm showing the Appalachian cottontail. We have two different kinds of rabbits at the site. These are rabbits that are really well known from the fossil record. They have big ranges, but they're also really nice because they were only around for a limited time period. So they're really good for biochronology, for telling time. And it's really not surprising to find rabbits living in a forest like we've got today. And we have two different sizes, much like you find in a lot of places. You'll have cottontails living alongside hares. Some of the ecologically interesting things we got at the site are the rodents. And most places in the fossil record, squirrels, apart from ground squirrels and prairie dogs, the squirrels that are living in open habitats and burying themselves, really have a crummy fossil record. And at the Great Fossil Site, we actually have tree squirrels, basically Cyrus. We also have a chipmunk called Eutamius. And we've got two different kinds of flying squirrels. So Glaucomes is the flying squirrels we have living in the area today. And then we've got a single tooth so far of a giant flying squirrel. This is a thing called Myopedorista. It's known from all over the northern hemisphere. And there's a pretty complete skeleton that was described a couple of years ago from Spain. And the anatomy of this is basically like living giant flying squirrels in Asia today. So these very large flying squirrels, it's nearly the size of a house cat. If you see one in the forest, it's kind of like a kite flying there. But having these flying squirrels really points to having a dense forest environment. And then we've got a lot more rodents. So We've got lots of members of the Chrysetidae. These are mice and rats that tend to live in the New World. We've got several different species of mice. And then we've also got this very interesting wood rat. And wood rats, pack rats, they live all over North America today. The ones we have at the Gray Fossil Site may be their earliest record. And so this is one of those things that is a really good thing, again, for telling time, for chronology.
So Josh, when we look at this overall fauna, how does it compare really to other sites in North America, and how unique is the Gray Fossil Site?
Well, so most everything I've pointed to here are things that you're not going to find in a lot of sites. So wolverines in the Pleistocene are pretty common, but before that, they've got a...
Oh, it is Josh.
Tall. The skunk that we've got here, this is known from a lot of sites at the time. So this is something that was known from places in the Great Plains and also the Northwest. Basiliscus, it's known from lots of places. This Pediomryx, this sort of giraffe deer, it's known from lots of places. Camelops is known from lots of places. The rabbits are also known from lots of different places. The rodents, though, the tree squirrels and flying squirrels, really, before the Pleistocene, they have a terrible fossil record. And so they are really unique and really something that, apart from a few isolated discoveries, we are probably going to have the best records of these things from this time period at Gray.
So with these new discoveries, how does it help us narrow down the age of the fossil site?
Well, some of these animals, like chipmunks, are something that dispersed into North America probably around 7 million years ago. Things like these wood rats show up right around 5 million years ago. Things like castor showed up right around 7 million years ago. So quite a few of these animals are things that dispersed to North America from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge. And so that's a very nice, nice point to use for something like biochronology, for trying to figure out the age of a site. So using a whole series of these organisms, we can narrow down a window of time that this site is known from. So things like rhinos all vanished right around 4.5 million years ago across the continent. Combining that with things like these wood rats that showed up right around 5 million years ago, it gives us that narrow window of 4.9 to 4.5 million years.
Great, great.
The last couple of things I was going to mention are, we've got two different kinds of beavers at the site. We've got little bits of castor and dipoides. Those are very common in the fossil record, and they both point to having persistent water at the site. So the fact that we've got beavers there, it means it wasn't an environment that just had water ephemerally. Sometimes it was really, there must have been some kind of lake or stream that was standing continuous water there. Some of the reptiles and amphibians point to the same sort of thing. And the last one I'll mention is this interesting little mouse called Cichista. And this is a birch mouse, but it's actually something that's known from parts of Europe and Asia very commonly, but it has this long prehensile tail, and it's a mouse that really likes to climb in trees. So like the flying squirrels and tree squirrels, it points to, again, a forest environment. And so kind of bringing this all together, the interpretation of the Gray Fossil Site is being forested based on the fauna, flora, some isotopic studies. All of those point to the site being forested and really densely forested. That contrasts really strongly with pretty much all the other fossil sites we've got in North America at the time. So when you go to the end of the Miocene and the Pliocene, grass, other kinds of open habitats like shrublands, that's what's common at most sites we know. So this is one from, this is the Rattlesnake Formation in Oregon, right around 7 million years ago. And you can see it's this open steppe environment with things like horses, camels. There's a lot of animals here that are really adapted for life in the open. When you look at places in the Great Plains, the Northwest, the West, even sites from this age in Florida, things like horses, llamas, camels, pronghorn are everywhere. So there's all of these open habitat adapted animals. Burrowing animals like prairie dogs and gophers are everywhere. we don't have any of those things in gray. We've got a couple of teeth of a horse, we've got a few bones of a camel, and that's it. And so it's a really strong contrast.
David,
So-
are we about at a point where we need to open up for questions of the audience?
Yeah, sure. We can go ahead and start taking questions. So if anyone in our participants list has any questions they'd like to ask of Josh, go ahead and type them up in the chat and we'll read them out. And while we're waiting for that, Josh, I'm seeing a notice on your shared screen that says move this window away from the application window, which I think
Not
means
sure.
that you have something else, a window opened on top of PowerPoint.
Okay.
So if that's something that you can adjust, if not, it's not a huge
Sure.
hindrance. It
I
just
try
means
stopping
that
my
there's-
share and give it back to you in just a moment.
Sure, sure. And I see that we've got questions already coming in. Yeah, I looked up that problem and it says that it means that another application window is open on top of the one that you're trying to share.
Huh.
And like I said, if that's something that takes more than 20 seconds to figure out, we'll just move on and get to questions.
I'll just go back to the share and see if it is
Okay.
working right now. There you go.
All right, and our first question has come in. So this is from Dario, who asks, any bovids or ursids?
No bovids. We don't have any members of that family yet. But we do have a bear, and the bear is Pleinarctos. It's a relative of the speckled bear, the short-faced bears in the Pleistocene. That is something that we tend to, we've got a pretty good record of so far. We've actually got part of a skull, we've got some jaws, some limb bones. All of that is really quite a rarity in the fossil record. Bears don't show up that often, and so the short-faced bears are really pretty exciting, and Blaine can tell you lots more about that too.
Another show.
Yeah, we'll do that another. We have another question. This one is from Colby, who asks, Josh, what is your favorite species that you have found in the Gray Fossil Site?
My favorite species of the Gray Fossil Site is probably that little birch mouse, Cichista, because it was such a shock to find it. It is one of the smallest known mammals, actually. So when you look at mammal body sizes today, it is right near the bottom of the size range for mammals. When we talk about the birch mouse, it's 5 to 10 grams. So a few paper clips is what it weighed. And it's really interesting to think about something like that, walking or climbing trees, spreading from Asia all the way to Tennessee. We are thousands of miles from other records of that animal. So it's a really interesting thing to think about something like that coming here.
Very good. Our next question is from Fluxor, who asks if we have any avians yet.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few bird fossils that show up at the site. Dave Stedman from the University of Florida is working on studying them now. I believe a lot of the things right now point to waterfowl. So a lot of the birds we have right now are things that you would expect to find around a pond or lake environment.
Next up is a question from Peter, who I think you know because you said hello earlier.
I do know Peter. Hi, Peter.
And Peter asks, you mentioned looking at functional morphology. I'm familiar with your work on rodents. Where are you going with functional study of gray fossils?
Well, I can move on to the next slide I've got here and just talk for a couple minutes about that. So things are very different. So the question is, how do you characterize the differences from other sites of similar age? And really the way to do it is to look at diet and locomotion. So if we want to characterize what a community was like, we look at these things. And I've compared it to the best known sites from the late Miocene and the Pliocene of North America. So these are—
We don't see a slide on your screen.
Okay, so I'll give you a share again. Here we go.
There it is.
There we go. Okay, so I compared this to well-known sites from the late Miocene and the Pliocene, and these are places like the Rattlesnake Formation in Oregon, the Hagerman fauna of Idaho, Rex rodent, Kansas, Beck Ranch in Texas, and the Palmetto in Florida. And so these are really all over the continent. Each one has more than 25 mammals. And what I did is I basically categorized things into tooth crown height. And in this case, you basically have, let me move this out of the way. The tooth crown height can be low crown to high crowned, and high crowned teeth are an adaptation for eating tough plants. So when we think about something like a horse, they've got these very tall teeth. It's something that helps facilitate grazing on grasses. Things like beavers and camels have the same sort of thing. Gophers do as well. So I categorize things into those crown height categories, and then also locomotor groups. And since a lot of these things are still alive today, we know fairly well what they were doing. So since a lot of these are living genera or closely related to things alive today, we know what their lifestyle was like. And so just examine what's the abundance of those. So if we look at the gray fossil site, in terms of crown height, more than half the species there have these low crown teeth. And so functionally that says they were eating leaves, fruit, soft food. When you look at some of these other sites in the Great Plains, like Rex rodent, Kansas, or Beck Ranch in Texas, they have a quarter of the species there have ever-growing teeth, and half of the things have incredibly tall teeth, pretty much at every other site. And what that means is we have lots of things that are grazers or feeding on tough vegetation. And gray is the opposite. We have really just over 30% are things with these tall teeth. And then the last one I'll point to is locomotion. And when you look at all of these sites, in terms of gray, really we've got lots of these climbing adapted things. So arboreal, that's basically things that feed in the trees. If you think of something like a squirrel, it feeds up in the trees. Scansorial, they climb sometimes, like a raccoon. Those sorts of things are nearly a quarter of the species at gray, and most of the other sites have very few, and particularly they have few things that feed in the trees. So we don't find things like tree squirrels or flying squirrels at any of these other sites. And we have a lot less running adapted species. So gray, it's about 20%. We've got those rabbits, we've got a camel, we've got some, a few specimens of a horse. But you look at most of the other sites, they're dominated by runners and diggers, and gray just isn't. And so that's how we would characterize the communities. And so that's kind of where I'm going with all of this, is trying to look at all the mammals here, the sorts of ecology they have, what they're doing, and use that to get an idea of how different this was from these other sites.
All right, we've got a long list of questions, so we're going to try to get through a few more of them before we wrap up.
Okay.
This next one is from Shane. Are the fossilized rabbits larger or smaller than today's cottontails?
So we've got two species. One is slightly smaller than cottontails today, one's slightly larger.
And then we have a question from Rebecca, who says, I'm watching with my son, who's in the 4th grade, and he wants to know what species is most commonly found in the fossil record and why is it most common?
So the thing that we're finding most commonly at gray are those tapirs. They show up. We've got more than 70 individuals at this point that we know we have represented at the site. And it's probably because they were spending a lot of time around water. And when you look at tapirs today, that's what they do. They tend to congregate around water sources. And it just happens if they die near those water sources, their bones can get buried and preserved. And they're probably showing up much more often than things that were less dependent on water.
John asks, is there anything you expect to find but haven't yet?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that we expect to find. This time period, when you go to other sites, some of those animals like horses are just incredibly common all over the continent. So we haven't found really very much of horses yet. We've got a couple of teeth, a few toe bones. Another thing that we expect to find, if you go down to Florida at the same time period, there's some of the earliest relatives of deer, and the same thing in the Northwest. So members of the deer family might have also been showing up at gray. And then finally, there's more predators that we would expect to see. We don't have a lot of big top predators. So we've got a few fragments of a saber-toothed cat, But this time period, mountain lions, bobcats were present in North America. There were lots of saber-toothed cats. Some of the early relatives of wolves were around. So maybe things like that.
All right. Now, Orion has asked a question, which was answered in the chat by Nick and Blaine, who asked, what does it mean when you have a genus and then spa? And I'll answer that real quick for anyone else who's interested. Where it says something like alligator SP, that means we know the genus is alligator, and the SP means we don't know what the species is just yet. This is another one for Josh. This one comes from Nicholas, our Nicholas, here at ETSU. Do any of the otherwise familiar gray fossil site animals, that is to say, stuff we have around today, appear to differ significantly in ecology from their modern relatives?
So that's something with bigger samples we'll be able to answer. So right now, we don't have enough of a lot of these animals to really say how might they have been different from their living relatives. Might they have been doing some kind of different role? So if we have something like a camel, maybe it was a camel that was feeding more on softer leaves and maybe fruit than what we might expect in other camels feeding on things like grasses.
This
So
is a
Josh,
question.
we're gonna start wrapping it up. So we'll probably do one more question,
Okay.
and
I
then
was gonna,
allow you to summarize if you'd like, if you have any additional slides to get to.
Just like one, yeah.
so we the last three questions are all presence absence questions. So we can lightning round through these three if you want, Josh.
Sure.
These are from Bo Carson and Alberto, who want to know if we have found rodent coprolites or other herbivore coprolites, fish or otoliths, or canids at Gray.
So coprolites we don't have any of yet. So as far as I know, we haven't found anything that we can say these are really coprolites of any of these animals. We do have fish at the site. There are actually some really nicely preserved ones, and there do seem to be a few otoliths that have shown up. So there are some fish that definitely need to be studied. And then we do have a single bone of a canid. I'm currently working with Emily Bogner, and we're describing that. It's the genus Borophagus. That was what people had thought it probably was before, but it's the big bone cracking dog that's common across North America at the time, but one bone of a canid.
All right, thank you everybody for those questions. If you have more, go ahead, throw them in the chat. But for now, let's go ahead and get to the wrapping up. Go ahead, Blaine.
Well, Josh, you mentioned you might have another slide or two that you wanted to show.
Just one summary slide.
Okay.
And so what I wanted to point to is just there are really clear differences between the community at the Gray Fossil Site and other sites at similar age. There's lots of low-crowned herbivores, so things eating fruits and soft leaves, lots of climbing adapted taxa, something you don't see in most places, and far fewer burrowing and running adapted taxa than other sites. And again, this goes right along with the other studies of the site and points to it being a relatively closed forested habitat. It highlights how unique the site is, not just in terms of its age and where it is, but also the environment preserved. You don't have this sort of environment preserved at very many sites in North America.
Great. Well, thank you, Josh. We're going to conclude this episode, and what we're going to do though is you can continue to ask questions if you'd like in the chat. Also, Josh, David, and I will stay on here for a little bit longer after I turn the record off. I want to remind everybody, let everybody know that we have another speaker coming up next week, and that's Dr. Stephen Wallace, and he will be talking about one of his areas of expertise, which is red pandas. So again, thank you all for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you.